General Audience number 31 of June 25th, 1980. Where does the insatiability of the union come from? The analysis we carried out during the last reflection was centered on the following words of Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, addressed by God Yahweh to the first woman after original sin. Quote, "Your desire shall be for your husband, but he will dominate you." Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. We arrived at the conclusion that these words contain an adequate clarification and a deeper interpretation of original shame. See Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, which became part of man and woman together with concupiscence. The explanation of this shame should not be sought in the body itself, in the somatic sexuality of both, but it goes back to the deepest transformations suffered by the human spirit. Precisely this spirit is particularly aware of how insatiable it is with regard to the mutual union between man and woman. In addition, this consciousness shifts the blame to the body, so to speak. It takes from the body the simplicity and purity of the meaning connected with the original innocence of the human being. In relation to this consciousness, shame is a secondary experience. While on the one hand, it reveals the moment of concupiscence, at the same time, it can provide weapons ahead of time against the consequences of the threefold component of concupiscence. One can even say that through shame, man and woman almost remain in the state of original innocence. In fact, they continually become conscious of the spousal meaning of the body and intend to protect it, so to speak, from concupiscence. Just as they try to maintain the value of communion or of the union of persons in the unity of the body. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 speaks with discretion, but also clarity about the union of bodies in the sense of the authentic union of persons. Quote, "The man will unite with his wife, and the two will be one flesh." And from the context, it is clear that this union comes from a choice, given that the man leaves father and mother to unite with his wife. Such a union of persons implies that they become one flesh. Starting from this sacramental expression, which corresponds to the communion of persons of the man and the woman in their original call to conjugal union, we can understand better the message proper to Genesis chapter 3, verse 16. That is, we can establish and reconstruct, as it were, what the imbalance consists of. Even better, the special deformation of the original interpersonal relationship of communion to which the sacramental words of Genesis 2:24 refer. One can therefore say, to show the deeper meaning of Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, that on the one hand, the body, which is constituted in the unity of the personal subject, does not cease to arouse the desires for personal union, precisely due to masculinity and femininity. Your desire shall be for your husband. On the other hand, concupiscence itself simultaneously directs these desires in its own way. This is confirmed by the expression, "He will dominate you." Now, the concupiscence of the flesh directs these desires toward the appeasement of the body, often at the cost of an authentic and full communion of persons. In this sense, attention should be paid to the manner in which the semantic emphases are distributed in the verses of Genesis chapter 3. In fact, although they are scattered, they reveal an inner coherence. The man seems to feel shame of his body with particular intensity. Quote, "I was afraid because I am naked, and I hid myself." Genesis chapter 3, verse 10. These words highlight the truly metaphysical character of shame. At the same time, the man is the one for whom shame, united with concupiscence, was to become an impulse to dominate the woman. He will dominate you. Later, the experience of such domination shows itself more directly in the woman as the insatiable desire for a different union. From that moment in which the man dominates her, the communion of persons, which consists in the spiritual unity of the two subjects who gave themselves to each other, is replaced by a different mutual relationship, namely by a relationship of possession of the other as an object of one's own desire. If this impulse prevails in the man, the desires that the woman directs toward him, according to the expression of Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, can assume and do assume an analogous character. And perhaps at times they perceive the man's desire or even attempt to arouse it and give it impetus. The text of Genesis 3:16 seems to point above all to the man as the one who desires, analogous to the text of Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28, which is the point of departure of the present meditations. Nevertheless, both the man and the woman have become a human being subject to concupiscence. And for this reason, the lot of both is shame. whose deep resonance touches the innermost being of both the male and the female personality, even though in a different way. What we grasp in Genesis 3 barely allows us to outline this duality, but even the mere hints are already very significant. We add that this text, which is so ancient, is surprisingly eloquent and acute. Section C, the corruption of the spousal meaning of the body. Meaning, measure of the heart. An adequate analysis of Genesis 3 leads thus to the conclusion that the threefold concupiscence, including that of the body, brings with it a limitation of the spousal meaning of the body itself, the spousal meaning in which man and woman shared in the state of original innocence. When we speak about the meaning of the body, we refer above all to the full consciousness of the human being. But we also include every affective experience of the body in its masculinity and femininity, and in any case, the constant predisposition to such an experience. The meaning of the body is not something merely conceptual. We have already sufficiently directed the attention of earlier analyses to this point. The meaning of the body is at the same time what shapes the attitude. It is the way of living the body. It is the measure that the inner man, that is, the heart, to which Christ appeals in the Sermon on the Mount, applies to the human body with regard to its masculinity or femininity, and thus with regard to its sexuality. That meaning does not modify the reality in itself, that is, that which the human body is and does not cease to be in the sexuality that belongs to it, independently of the states of our consciousness and our experiences. Yet, apart from the system of real, concrete relations between man and woman, the purely objective meaning of the body and of sex is in some sense ahistorical. In the present analysis, we, by contrast, take into account man's historicity in conformity with the biblical sources, also because we start from man's theological prehistory. What is evidently at stake here is an inner dimension that escapes the outer criteria of a historicity, but that can still be considered historical. Even more, it stands at the root of all facts that constitute man's history, also the history of sin and salvation, and in this way they reveal the depth and very root of his historicity. In this vast context, when we speak about concupiscence as a limitation, violation, or complete deformation of the spousal meaning of the body, we go back above all to our earlier analyses regarding the state of original innocence, that is, man's theological prehistory. At the same time, we have in mind the measure that historical man, with this heart, applies to his own body in regard to male and female sexuality. This measure is not something exclusively conceptual. It is what shapes the attitudes and is in general decisive for the way of living the body. Certainly, Christ refers to this measure in the Sermon on the Mount. We are trying here to approach the words taken from Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 28 at the very threshold of man's theological prehistory, considering them already in the context of Genesis chapter 3. Concupiscence as a limitation, violation, or complete deformation of the spousal meaning of the body can be observed in a particularly clear way, despite the conciseness of the biblical account, in the first two parents, Adam and Eve. Thanks to them, we have been able to find the spousal meaning of the body, and to rediscover what it constitutes of the measure of the human heart, such that it shapes the original form of the communion of persons, if in their personal experience, which the biblical text allows us to follow, that original form suffered imbalance and deformation, as we tried to show through the analysis of shame. Then what likewise suffered deformation was the spousal meaning of the body, which was the measure of the heart of both, of the man and the woman, in the situation of original innocence. If we succeed in reconstructing what this deformation consists of, we will also have the answer to our question, namely, what the concupiscence of the flesh consists of, and what constitutes its theological and at the same time anthropological specificity. It seems that a theologically and anthropologically adequate answer, important in regard to the meaning of Christ's words in the Sermon on the Mount, can already be drawn from the context of Genesis 3, and from the whole Yahweh's text, which has allowed us earlier to clarify the spousal meaning of the human body.